My name is Vincent Randall. I'm a Tono Apache, which is what the anthropologists call us. We call ourselves Dilze, which is a subdivision of the Ne. The Ne would be equivalent to like the people or the human beings. And the Dilze is a sub-branch of the human beings, which is named, comes from the word Dilze, which means hunting. And so we're known as the hunting group. We call this place Tusitsil, which means broken water. In other words, to emerge from the underworld and to come out through here, through broken water. And today the well is very significant to us, and we still have our people come and pray, and they use their stones to pray with. It is a area to come for pilgrimage, and but that's how significant it is to us. Very sacred, holy place.
My name is Pharaoh Sikakuku. I'm a member of the Hopi tribe, Hopi Nation, also a member of the Snake Clan. Each Hopi represents himself with a clan title because that's how they associate to each other throughout the land of the Hopi. My clan, the Snake, really didn't come here, but we know of this place. But it was the Water Clan that brought the serpent and left it here. But this became one of the most sacred springs. The Hopis call it Yuvukava. The Hopis believe that this is endless. There's a fork underneath there. One goes north, one goes south, because
time. They did. Mm-hmm. Now, the tribe that actually comes back here the most often that I know of, and they come, I mean, every year they come here and do a major ceremony, is the Yavapai. The Yavapai are the Inner Earth people. They started under the ground in the Inner Earth, and at one point their civilization was flooded, a huge flood. It was the same time as there was a flood on the top of the surface of the earth. It flooded their kingdom under the earth. And so at that point they said, okay, we're doomed unless we can save some of our race. So they put this girl in a canoe, a Yavapai, a young girl, and she floated up with the waters. As the waters filled up the underworld, she floated right to a big hole to the top of the earth. She floated up through what is today known as Montezuma Well. It's a big sinkhole. And then so since the top of the earth was also flooded, she kept going. And she floated all the way right into Boyne Canyon. And she floated right into a cave there. And then from that point on, she started the Yavapai race on the surface of the planet. She was drawn to go to a mountain close by here. When she climbed to the top of that, where she was inseminated by the sun, and then she went back into Boyne Canyon and gave birth to a girl and a daughter, and then later on her daughter went through the same process and gave birth to a son. And it's these three that became kind of the matriarch, patriarch of the Yavapai race. So this is what's commemorated by the Yavapai every year. They come here right next to that cave and do a major ceremony.
Perhaps as far north as 4 Points, and then whoosh, does a beeline right here, neither collecting nor losing any water.
Closed system.
Pardon me?
Closed
system. And what's very remarkable about that is it has to cross a lot of faults to get here, and to think that it gets here unaffected is
right.
A little weird, because that's a long journey. A long journey.
And it's interesting, too, that when you look at it from a spiritual perspective, that the Hopis believe that their connection is to the Sonomans.
Yeah.
That's right. And in fact, I have stories that would freak you out that some of the Hopis and Navajos have told me.
Oh, wow.
From here. Well, one of them being that room that you're talking about right there. Some have told me that that's a Kiva, actually.
A site for one of their early
Although it's not circular, and it's not in the ground at all.
What's
Kiva generally is those two things at least.
What is a Kiva?
It's like something akin to what a chapel, a church.
It's their ceremonial
worshiping point.
Ah.
It's also where men on their rite of passage would go in as boys and come out as men after having undergone some weird thing which no white men will know about because the Indians won't allow us to.
Strictly indigenous to their culture.
Yeah, so anyway, there is this story that some elders were drinking a little too much and began to take women into the Kiva.
The mouth of the snake is viewed as a place of arrival and departure of spirit beings. So gods, angels, Quetzalcoatl, whatever. You could also think of it as a wormhole. It's an opening or closing point where these gods can enter and disappear into, but that they use to navigate the dimensions of heaven. For example, the god Quetzalcoatl, who besides the conversations we've had, he's actually the most well-known Aztec deity. He's portrayed as either being or entering the Ouroboros on Aztec and Toltec ruins. And in some renderings, there's actually a ladder that's seen descending from the ecliptic, such as when Quetzalcoatl descends from the sky on a rope ladder. You can see that in some of the Mesoamerican drawings. But anyway.
Hey, Tom, it's important for people to understand, too, the word Amaruca. That literally means the land of the plumed serpent, okay? Land.
Meet with God, what has he got to do? He's got to go to the top of Mount Sinai, and there he will meet with God. When Jesus comes back, what does it say? His feet will touch the top of the Mount of Olives, and from there he will descend down into the Mountain of the Plains. Mount Hermon is the location in the book of Enoch, which used to be part of the canon of Scripture. It's not today. Almost all of the early church fathers quoted it as canon, but I'm not going to make an argument about that. But the book of Enoch says that it was in the days of Jared that these watchers descended down onto Mount Hermon. So what am I saying? There is this idea that mountainous locations are often identified in the Bible as places where entities move in and out of Earth's reality. Oh, and by the way, Mount Hermon is where Jesus is years later with his disciples. So get this image in your mind, because here once again I said you can't understand the Old Testament unless you understand what the Watchers were doing in terms of challenging God. They were going to cut off the birth line of the Messiah, but they were also going to take dominion away from God over the earth. So here's Jesus, and he comes into Caesarea Philippi, which is at the base of Mount Hermon. The base of Mount Hermon was believed by the Hebrews to be the gateway to the underworld, the gateway to Sheol Hades. That's what the Lord's disciples would have believed. And that's right, by the way, that's also Deuteronomy 3, when you mention Og, the king of Bashan. Bashan is right there, where it is believed to have been the gateway to the underworld. But what does Jesus do? He meets with his disciples at the base of Caesarea Philippi, and he says, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. He is literally sending a signal to the Watchers. He is sending a signal to the fallen angels and to the spirits that are bound in the underworld, that though they tried to cut off the birth line leading to him, Matthew, the entire first part of the book of Matthew, establishes the priesthood of Jesus, the pure bloodline of Jesus that is both Abrahamic, he come through Abram, also Davidic, the covenant of David, and so the King of Kings and Lord of Lords is here. When he says the gates of hell, the literal opening into the underworld, this will not prevail against my church. What the Watchers tried to do, this is not going to prevail against my church. By the way, continue reading that story. What does it say? Within 3 days, he goes with his disciples up onto the top of a mountain. Well, guess what? The only mountain that's within a 3-day walk of Caesarea Philippi is Mount Hermon, the literal mountain upon which the Watchers descended in the days of Jared, and that was believed in history to be the gateway to the underworld and a forbidden place. He goes up onto that mountain, and he is transfigured. Only a short distance later, he is crucified, and what does it say? He goes into the underworld. What does it say? To preach to the spirits in prison. Now, this is not the people that are in paradise, that are in Abram's bosom. He's preaching to the spirits that are in prison. These are the renegade offspring of the Watchers that were bound in the underworld that tried to cut off the birth line of the Messiah. He literally goes down there and says, sorry, boys, you failed. I'm here. And then what does it say? When he comes up from out of the underworld, he brings with him the keys to death, hell, and the grave. This is why I say that if you understand the story of the Watchers and what they were trying to do, it'll totally bring the Old Testament alive to you. But the point was, I'm sorry I started preaching there. The point was, we wanted to verify.
That was good preaching, Tom. Keep going.
That there are mountainous locations identified as places where entities, both good and evil, move in and out of Earth reality, that this is something that was biblical. And so a huge part of the book that we wrote called On the Path of the Immortals was verifying this one fact, because we knew that there would be everything from, entry-level Christians to Bible scholars who would be asking this question: why are you even taking time to talk to these Native Americans? What in the world does that have to do with the world? And what we learned was they were saying something from their own worldview that had been paganized, but it corroborated this Old Testament premise that indeed there was a global historic event, and people around the world verified it. I mean, as far back as the beginning of time, from Egypt to Persia, from Rome and Greece, Assyria, Babylonia, Sumeria, they were all telling the same story that Moses is telling, that you quoted at the introduction of this show, that there were giants. This literally did happen. It was not just mythology. This did occur. And people around the world that had no capacity for communicating with one another verified that it did happen. Now, what Steve was saying a moment ago, that's the most overlooked aspect of biblical prophecy. Not only did it happen once before, but according to Bible prophecy, it's going to happen again. And that is something that almost everybody everywhere misses. Most churches, most people attending a church will have never even heard this fact, that according to Bible prophecy, those gateways of the earth, they're going to open again in the Great Tribulation period, and giants are going to literally erupt up from out of the earth. For instance, according to Isaiah 13. Isaiah 13, which talks about the ultimate destruction of Babylon, which has not happened yet. But what does it say in Isaiah 13? It says this, and I'm reading this from the Septuagint because the ancient Hebrew scholars that translated the Hebrew into the Greek Septuagint understood the story better than most modern translators do. Here's what it says. It says, the vision which Isaiah son of Amos saw against Babylon, lift up the standard on the mountain of the plain, exalt the voice to them, beckon with the hand, open the gates. Now notice that's plural, not just one gate. Open the gates, ye rulers. I give command, and I bring them. Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath. And then you can go on and read the rest of that text. So,
Tom, are they...
Another additional thing about what happened at Mount Graham and the American Indians and why we pursued seeking their knowledge, because a lot of people might think of that and say, well, who cares what American Indians think? I mean, it's what? It's just a bunch of New Age psychobabble. Who cares what they think? And what does that have to do with the Bible? But we found there really was a very strong connection.
Go ahead.
Well, just only that when we came off the mountain and we learned from the Apache that they have this, their oldest history involves a story that sounds like it was taken out of the Old Testament. The great God created everything good on the earth, then a portal opened, a fallen reptilian deceiver, and when you see their ancient petroglyphs, which were written at the same time as the Old Testament was written, they show a reptilian with a halo around his head coming through a doorway in the four corners. He teaches the American Indians to practice witchcraft. And by the way, I went to the Four Corners, met with one of the academics from the Navajo Nation, Dr. Don Mose. He's a third-generation medicine man and an academic, very sympathetic to Christians. However, he's got a lot of Christian friends. I actually got my meeting set up with him through an American missionary to the American Indians. But he told us in the native tongue, he allowed me to interview him for 3 hours about the oldest stories of American history and what happened to the Anasazi, whose name can actually be translated an ancient alien enemy, and why they left and departed their cliff dwellings there in the Four Corners. He explained their petroglyphs to me and this story of the great creator who made everything beautiful, everything wonderful. Then the doorway opened, this reptilian deceiver comes through, which was basically a seraphim, a fallen flying seraphim. If you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, it describes the leader of the Watchers who came down and created these giants that we're talking about today. And it actually names him Makarisha, but it describes him as being very reptilian, very dark in appearance, with snake-like appearance, very scary to look upon. Well, that's exactly what is depicted in the American Indian petroglyphs. And as soon as this doorway opens, how'd the doorway open, by the way? Both the petroglyphs explain it, and Dr. Don Mose explains that this deceiver came through, and he began teaching the Indians to practice pharmakia, sorcery, magic, mind-expanding drugs in their underground kivas for the purposes of circumventing God, in order to open doorways to entities that were beyond a veil. And so this is exactly what the book of Revelation chapter 9 talks about, that when the doorways of the earth are open. In Revelation 9 it describes the angels that are bound in the great river Euphrates coming up to the surface of the earth. It also describes a mighty angel that comes down and opens the bottomless pit, and up out of the earth come through these gateways, these doorways, these transgenic beings that are going to torture humanity. But those who are seeking them, it says at the end of Revelation 9, and yet they repented not of their sorcery, their pharmakia, their efforts to open a doorway into the underworld. Well, Dr. Mose, the petroglyphs all explain that that's what the American Indians were doing. They were trying to open doorways to the underworld, and when those doorways opened, giants literally erupted up from out of the underworld to the surface of the earth. As Steve said a moment ago, they became cannibalistic. So it was very supportive, but again, besides being corroborative of the Old Testament story, the thing that was in my mind and Chris Putnam's mind when we were writing Exo Vaticana, that book that came out based on that visit to Mount Graham, the thing that was in our mind was, are we going to take heat from the Christian community? Are they going to be saying, well, why do you bother, trying to interpret or translate anything based on what some, American Indians might say, for crying out loud? And so the first thing we wanted to do was verify whether or not there was any biblical precedent for this idea that there are strategic locations on the earth, which is what they were telling us Mount Graham is, a doorway. Is that a biblical idea? And once we started looking into the Scripture, we realized that from the Old Testament to the New, you cannot escape this idea, whether it was Genesis 28, Jacob's ladder, a very strategic location where he sees a spiral vortex, or the King James Version calls it a stairway, others call it a spiral stairway, but this area where these angels are ascending and descending to the earth. Genesis 10:8, Cush begets Nimrod. Nimrod began to be a Gibborim, and then immediately he goes to Genesis chapter 11 to the plains of Shinar, a very specific location where he's going to build a tower whose top will do what? Reach into Shamayim, the dwelling place of God. So we started noticing from the Old Testament and then over to the New, Jesus saying, from henceforth you will see the windows of heaven open and angels ascending and descending. That this idea that there are places on the earth and there are people who are associated with strategic locations on which these doorways, these gateways open up. Mount Sinai. If Moses is going to meet with God, what does he got to do? He's got to go to the top of Mount Sinai, and there he will meet with God. When Jesus comes back, what does it say? His feet will touch the top of the Mount of Olives, and from there he will descend down into the Mountain of the Plains. Mount Hermon is the location in the book of Enoch, which used to be part of the canon of Scripture. It's not today. Almost all of the early church fathers quoted it as canon, but I'm not going to make an argument about that. But the book of Enoch says that it was in the days of Jared that these watchers descended down onto Mount Hermon. So what am I saying? There is this idea that mountainous locations are often identified in the Bible.
And you mentioned a moment ago that there's different worldviews among the Sunni, the Shia, and whatever. And I learned that the Sunni, they don't believe the Mahdi's here yet. Mm-hmm. He's coming. The Shia believe he's already here, and that he's in a well with a magical door above it.
Occlusion, right?
Yeah, he's in inclusion, and that what they call it, culturation or whatever the term is called, where
occultation or occlusion, I believe is the word. Yeah, he's hidden.
Right. But then he's going to come up out of this well. And that, I think, also gives us some talking points that come out of the book of Revelation. I mean, did you ever stop to think that where the Islamic nation is right now is all along the Euphrates River? The Euphrates comes out of Turkey. It flows down through Syria, Iraq, all the way out to the Persian Gulf. And this is that very place in the Bible, the very stomping grounds of the Islamic nation is where in Revelation 9 the trumpets start sounding. And what does it say? It says
the four angels that are bound in the Euphrates.
Yeah. So they're waiting for something to come out of the ground. The Bible also says in that very area there are things that are going to come up out of the great river Euphrates, and they're going to wipe out 1/3 of humanity.
Right, right.